Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about the debut album from a guy called Gerald, Hot Lemonade. Okay, we are finally getting into the next discography review, and this one's been a long time coming. Given the typical subject matter of this channel, I was inevitably gonna have to do a proper series on Gerald Simpson. I'd already done a full series on 808 State years ago, one of my favorite bands of all time, and I also thought it was pretty pathetic that I've been doing this channel for 5 years and not done a full dedicated series on a black artist yet. That needs to be fixed, so I'm doing this. A guy called Gerald needs a full discography review to himself. This guy's solo career has been plenty interesting and influential in its own right. He's a pretty loaded part of electronic music history and merits having his catalog broken down in greater detail. So I'm going to be talking about all 9 of his main studio albums. There is supposedly a 10th one in 1999 called Cryogenics that I'm not going to be able to talk about because it was only ever available to listen to on an old MP3 website and a super rare limited edition CD run, and is no longer available to listen to literally anywhere on the internet anymore. I think it was already just unreleased B-sides from his archives anyway, so yeah, whatever. That's not getting a video. And of course, apologies in advance if I get any historical details wrong, given I am American and in my mid-20s, and did not see any of these albums as they came out, or was there to see any of this stuff. Feel absolutely free to yell corrections at me if I screw something up again. Not that I should ever be treated as like a reference publication to begin with, but yeah, just stuff to keep in mind. You should know the deal by now. So yeah, I marathoned this guy's catalog a few years ago, I think after I'd already started this channel. I can't remember when exactly. Gerald's solo stuff doesn't have as deep a personal connection with me as the main 808 State albums, but that doesn't make it any less important to highlight and talk about. Now, before we talk about Hot Lemonade, we are gonna have to talk about New Build again briefly. I did already review this one, and in that video I credited that project as basically the project that first brought Acid House to the UK, taking those sounds that had already been well established in Chicago House and Detroit Techno, still in its somewhat earlier stages, and really popularizing the genre in the UK scene. They were not the first ever British artists to make Acid House. But they certainly really helped kick off that trend. But specific credit has to be given to Gerald himself, not just because I'm pretty sure he's behind the vast majority of that album in general, but also because while that album was being worked on, Gerald would sneak off with some of the equipment sometimes and start working on his own stuff on the side. And at one point, he ended up with a bona fide hit of his own, what may have been the first big Acid House hit over there, Voodoo Ray. Featuring vocals from Nicola Collier and co-production from Capture, aka Anif Akinola and Colin Thorpe, who also contributed to the production on this album as well to various extents. But yeah, that track was huge and has since attained legendary status. It climbed up to number 12 on the UK singles charts, which, holy crap, I can't imagine an underground dance club track like that getting this kind of traction on this side of the Atlantic. It got big enough that the original LP version of New Build has a sticker on it that says, featuring a guy called Gerald. It's still the guy's signature track to this day, and was also tacked onto the end of this album, even though it wasn't on the first LP version. But anyway, with that big hit under his belt and his work with 808 State being developed at around the same time, we finally got his debut project here in 1989. Technically it had been finished the year previous. This stuff was made at the same time as New Build, I believe. But it dropped the year after that album on Ram Records. Now, it's worth noting that I've said before that New Build is my personal least favorite 808 State album. I mean, I still sprung for the CD because the band's work was that formative to my tastes, and I wanted to make sure that I had all their albums. But, yeah, I always thought that project, as influential as it was, hasn't aged super well. Not just because literally its entire appeal hinges on TB303 acid synths, which I may really enjoy, they're just definitely a product of a different time, to say the least. But it's also extremely repetitive and fairly basic and bare bones in its construction. Some tracks like Dr. Lowfruit can really get on my nerves if I'm not in the right mood. And it's also super short, really doesn't feel like there's much of anything to it. Hot Lemonade carries over some similar issues, but quite frankly, I feel like this project holds up way better than New Build. I mean, it's still very much a product of its time. Once again, there's a ton of influences from the Chicago house and Detroit techno scenes at the time, and like New Build, these tracks tend to be pretty dang repetitive. If you've heard the first minute or two of any given track, you've basically heard everything the track has to offer. Though I think the overall listening experience is a lot more fun and varied and substantive and well realized. I mean, I suppose New Build is tighter and more cohesive than this, but I am much more likely to want to come back to Hot Lemonade. I think it outdoes that project in basically every way. So, may as well get into individual tracks. We start with the title track, Hot Lemonade, and this is definitely the punchiest and sonically densest track in the bunch. Lively horn sections, 808 cowbells, sound effects of presumably actual hot lemonade being poured, and vocal appearances from Brenda Petrie, mostly just belting out the title over and over. Hot Lemonade. There's some other guy moaning the title in the background too. I don't know if that's Gerald himself or Akinola, but whatever. It's just very much classic house material, predictive of the likes of artists like Basement Jaxx later on, and it's a ton of fun. The rest of the album isn't as overtly punchy or energetic as the title track, but that doesn't mean it's any less compelling. Following track, Rhythm of Life, takes a lot of cues from the then-budding deep house scene. Subtle synth pads and deep plunking bass lines that create a really infectious groove. More bongos and cowbells among the drum machines. Maybe a few little horn stabs here and there. Very smooth stuff all around. Very nice. Arcade Fantasy has a similar blend, repetitive vocal snippets saying the title but being stuttered into oblivion over a few layers of acid synths and some wailing pads. And those filtered hi-hats are a nice touch as well. Not a lot of bass here, but still definitely creates as solid a groove as the other tracks here. Radioactive is not as big a highlight as its surrounding tracks, mainly because the vocal snippet on top is even more repetitive than most of the other hooks here. We are radio, we are radio, we are radio, we barely changes it all over the course of the 3 minutes it goes on and gets still quicker than other hooks on this album. But still, the bass lines and 808 heavy beat and little acid squirting and honking horns still give the track some compelling groove. It's still definitely a good track in spite of that, and is cut short before the vocal sample gets to be too grating. Then we take things down a notch with Muzic, Sweet Music, this kind of like more airy down-tempo cut. Lots of warm pad progressions and more vocals from Brenda Petrie, albeit with a much more restrained, like, Love to Love You Baby style performance. Though still got all the little acid synths and bass lines and 808 percussion from previous tracks to make sure it doesn't feel out of place. Very nice stuff as well. Moving into the second half of this album, we get a bunch of tracks that focus a lot more on the acid side of acid house, a lot more New Build-esque. This stuff doesn't grab my attention as consistently well as the first half of the album does, but it's still good stuff. In the beginning is the sparsest track in the bunch. The simple progression of acid synths and 808 drums is basically all it has, though it is also fairly short. It's good for what it is. And K9 has a similar blend, though the melodies here are noticeably, I guess, spookier and more awkward sounding. And there's this repetitive chopped up sample of some deep-voiced guy grunting out, "It's rough." Get it? Because the track's called K9. It's rough. I see what you did there! Yeah, that's probably my least favorite moment on here. Though then we get a similarly awkward-sounding acid house cut in Escape 2, and I think this cut was more successfully executed. The acid progressions going up against the 808s and cowbells and repetitive snippets of Shop as Usual and Is There Any Escape? Create a lot of nervous energy that can be pretty fun. The main vocal sample can be a little yelpy and annoying. I do probably prefer the original version of this track on the Voodoo Ray EP, which was just called Escape, and had a much more restrained voice saying, "Is there any escape?" that gets less intrusive. But whatever, yeah, this version's still good. Anyway, from there, the project does pick back up and pull me in more after this. I Am Somebody has a much more grooving and catchy bass line going over its 808 beats and shouting stuttered snippets, as well as a bunch of really nice, sorta jazzy keyboard solos. That one's fun. And then we got Tranquility on Phobos, which does have an appropriately spacey bend to its squirty, wavering synth leads and cloudy pads, going over the usual blend of acid and 808s, though with more cowbells and chimes and whistles. Very nice stuff and would make for a pretty nice closer to this project. Also like how it feels like all of the instruments sound like they fall apart in a heap at the very end. A nice little touch. Though of course the version I'm used to finishes with Voodoo Ray, and I think I prefer that as a closer. I don't know, it just feels more fitting. I won't even say that that track is like my absolute favorite on this album, though unsurprisingly it is up there. The mix on this one may be pretty sparse compared to other moments on here, which might hit a bit harder for me, but Collier's soulful vocals going up against the simple bass lines and synths are nice and catchy and to the point, and this track does have the best use of the vocal snippets on this album. The voices saying the title originally supposed to say Voodoo Rage, but Gerald didn't have enough room in his sample to fit the whole thing, so it cuts off the G sound. And there's also those shouting voices saying, "Later!" That adds some more punchiness too. I mean, it's a classic track that's emblematic of an era, kinda like FSOL's Papua New Guinea, though obviously this came first and was actually a bigger hit. We wouldn't even have Papua New Guinea without Voodoo Ray. But yeah, that's Hot Lemonade. I obviously have my issues with this project, most notably the vocal snippets on many of these tracks can occasionally get a little intrusive in how repetitive they are. But it's really not that big an issue. I'm never so annoyed by any of these tracks that I ever want to skip them, even if they are just largely the same groove playing on loop. And it is really something that a classic dance album like this from 1989 still holds up so well and sounds as consistently good as it does even to this day. New Build is a bit of an acquired taste for me, but I feel like this one's a lot more accessible and easier to get into. It's well-paced, well-varied, well-produced, never boring, always fun and loose and danceable, and I'm not sure what else to say. It's a definite classic. If you haven't already heard it, make sure you pick it up, and I'm overall feeling an 8.5 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.